Hello and welcome back to the series of videos, Great Ideas in Psychology. This is part 17 in the series, and it is about feminist psychology. Let me begin with sharing the screen. Here we are, the cover of the book we are using by Professor Fatali Moqaddam, Great Ideas in Psychology, A Cultural and Historical Introduction. And we have turned now to chapter 17, titled Feminist Psychology. After this presentation, we will have 3 more parts to go, and then the series will come to an end. So in this part, we will try to address these questions. What is, first of all, feminist psychology? Is there a difference between feminist psychology and psychology for women? And if there's no difference, why do we hear the first label, not the second? And we want to also talk a little bit about possible critiques of feminist psychology. All right, so let's begin addressing the first question. What is feminist psychology? And let's pick a passage from the textbook, the book that kind of responds to this question. So, feminist psychology, we read, attempts to harness the power of psychology to improve the status of women. So it is a way of trying to orient psychology, the intellectual capacities, powers of this scientific discipline, in order to serve women. So feminist psychology, in the next passage, we read, feminist psychology is explicitly political and is nourished by the larger feminist movement. When we say it is explicitly political, what we mean is that it is possible for a psychological project, a psychological position to be implicitly political. And when that is the case, the psychological project or that style of psychological knowing, psychological assertions and theory, it seems to be not political, but that could be because it is in harmony with the political order, existing political forces and agendas. And for that reason, it doesn't challenge the political context within which it is happening. When a movement is, or when a field, a project becomes explicitly political, it usually is because it is becoming a challenge to the existing political order. And that challenge makes the political dimension of the project more visible. You pay attention to its political charge. One thing we should note quickly here is that this attitude, the feminist attitude in feminist psychology, asserts that the positive change that tries to serve women must begin in psychology. That is because psychology is a part of society. It is a part of a larger cultural context. So psychology is rooted and it is a part of the social cultural context. And assuming that there might be gender biases, racial biases, age-related biases in the larger society, these biases will be carried over into the smaller parts of society. So those biases will be reflected in psychology too. So it would be more practical to begin dealing with these biases, these problems that feminist psychology identifies within a more manageable domain or field of psychology itself. This is very similar to how the larger context of society relates to a smaller and more limited case, more particular case of a family. So you might, for example, identify some problems in your family dynamic, the way, for example, the mother of the family relates to the father, or vice versa. And then later you might realize that these family problems reflect societal problems, that it is not the family that bears all of the responsibility for the existence of biases, but there are societal trends, there are societal tendencies that are reflected, that show up in the way family members relate to each other. And the family of psychology, the academic discipline of psychology, also we can identify problems within it that reflect the problems of a larger context. Okay, so you might think about gender and gender differences. Here, an important question, and addressing this is, I think it provides an important clarification to what the aim of feminist psychology is and is not. So is feminist psychology based on gender differences or sex differences? Do feminist psychologists need to be committed to certain essential features of women? Do they need to say women have a different way of looking at the world, relating to reality, like women are more empathetic? Do feminist psychologists need to first say those things and be committed to those assertions about gender differences? No, not at all. You don't need to be committed to certain set essential features of different genders. And in fact, the clarification begins with identifying the difference between sex and gender. Sex is a biological category. Gender, by contrast, is a social and cultural category, and it is associated, like all cultural categories, with distinct norms and rules. So a person, when they identify with a gender, they perform that gender, they perform that role, that cultural category. It is, you can say, a person might be performing their gender role in a successful way or in an unsuccessful way, if they are trying to do that. A person may conform or may not choose to not conform. This is related to our discussion of chapter 15 about conformity and non-conformity. So a person might choose to conform to specific gender roles in their culture. You don't need to commit to the differences between genders to identify unfair treatment, to identify certain cultural practices that could be different. So for example, just remember from our discussion of IQ and IQ tests, this famous study by Lewis Terman, if I remember correctly, was done in California in the 1920s, 20s or 30s. What Terman did was he identified people who from very young age scored high on IQ tests. And he kept track of their lives, and he realized that many of them have successful lives, these high IQ individuals, that the high score in IQ correlates with intellectual achievements, career achievement, financial achievements, and health, and even marital satisfaction. One of the key findings was that those correlations, for the most part, apply to men in Terman's sample. They don't apply to women as much, because regardless of the IQ score, what we could predict about the women in Terman's sample was that most of the women became housewives. So the cultural force, the cultural expectation attached to the category of women was so strong that IQ did not influence, could not predict the outcome as much as that a very strong cultural expectation, that cultural force attached to the category of women. So feminism is, in general, a movement, an attitude that tries to identify these forces and examine them and hopefully diffuse or reduce or eliminate their influence when possible. So feminism, the main focus of the modern feminist movement, which gained considerable momentum in the 1960s, and in psychology, we can say in psychology it became prominent, influential, at least noticeable in the 1970s. In the 1970s, for example, we had rules against using the male gender pronoun as the default way of referring to third person. So the broader feminist movement, its task or its goal, its focus has been to transform society so that women can fully develop, or more fully develop, their talents and achieve equality in power, both inside and outside home. So in addition to being a movement concerned with knowing, concerned with knowledge, in addition to being an intellectual movement, feminism is a policy-oriented movement. Those two sides are inseparable from each other. The side that is concerned with transforming, changing, improving, and the side that is concerned with knowing and understanding. All right, now we should talk about certain positions, attitudes that feminism opposes. One of the first one might be more intuitively grasped. The second one might be a little bit less intuitive. The first one is the opposition between feminism and traditional values. Feminists oppose unexamined traditional values associated with strict gender roles. And they're also associated with giving limited or no freedom to women. So feminists, it might be quite obvious to say this. Every time somebody says a woman is supposed to blah, blah, a woman is supposed to stay home, raise kids, take care of the home, take care of the household, those are unexamined traditional values that we might take as natural, we might take as just as face value, and without examination, just embrace them in order to ultimately control the lives of women. Feminist psychologists have undermined the idea that there is one natural way for females and males to interact, as well as the so-called natural differences between females and males. So the way to be female, the right way to be male, the right way to be female is undermined. It doesn't make sense to talk in those ways. There are many different ways, and people should have the choice, ideally, to either adopt those traditional values, live by those traditional values, or not. The second opposition is between feminism and cultural relativism. Now, what does that mean? According to cultural relativism, the value of each culture can be assessed only from within the culture itself, within the context of the cultural group, which means that a universal set of criteria, universal standards for evaluating human behavior are rejected by cultural relativists. Okay, so they also say what is wrong behavior in one culture could be correct behavior in another culture. So we shouldn't judge cultures from outside. Feminist psychologists oppose this. Of course, they also propose that gender is constructed, gender is performed, but that doesn't mean that there are not better and worse ways of performing and constructing gender roles. Let's read this passage from the book. Feminist psychologists have proposed that gender identities are constructed, and women and men are positioned through everyday conversations. And they, feminist psychologists, have empirically studied everyday discourse to examine this idea. So every time, for example, in a conversation, a man hints traditional gender roles or gender norms associated with gender, every time in a conversation, a man hints at a woman what they should do or what they should not do because they are women. I remember when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the university, I will not give too much information about where I was and who I was around. I remember, and one of my colleagues was talking to one of their mentors, one of their advisors, and she mentioned that she likes programming and she's good at programming experiments, computer programming. And the reaction of that senior colleague, the man, the supervisor, the mentor, his reaction was, "But you are a woman." So that is something that is a piece of conversation, is a very small piece of a conversation, but is pushing a kind of gender role onto the conversation partner. It's like, you are a woman, so it's unexpected from you. You are an anomaly, or you are violating gender norms by being good at this skill. All right, let's continue. So the position that feminist psychologists adopt is not cultural relativism, because they still suppose that there are better and worse ways of constructing and performing gender identities. There are more fair, more just, more humane way of constructing gender identities and gender relations. All right, now, psychology for women. Is feminist psychology simply psychology for women? Part of feminist psychology is to construct, to create, and encourage a psychology that serves women better. But there is more to feminist psychology than just being psychology for women. But we should talk about this aspect of it first, before we talk about the broader aspect of it. So the psychology for women means paying attention to certain life experiences that are particular to women that men don't have access to. At least they don't have experiential access to, like menstrual cycles, pregnancy, childbirth, motherhood, menopause, and the psychological correlates of all of this. So you might say, okay, there might be a woman who doesn't experience childbirth, but even that woman might experience the cultural pressure toward being a mother. Like, okay, I choose not to be a mother, but I still experience the pressure from my peers, from my family member, from my friends to become a mother, to become someone who goes through childbirth and so on and so forth. Another aspect of this is to reject the male-centered views in psychology, to implicitly assume that men have these traits. They are maybe more logical, more rational, more objective. Of course, these are all nonsense, but we can adopt this type of nonsense when we don't examine them, when we just use the metaphors associated with maybe the metaphor of rationality being a male thing. Another case that I think is very useful in understanding that the task of feminist psychology, what it does, and how it serves not just women, is in the response from Carol Gilligan to Lawrence Kohlberg's work on the moral development of children. You might remember that Kohlberg had these ideas about children going through stages of moral development. And what is key here for us to note is that Kohlberg studied male children, male human children, so kids, boys, from a very young age, at a very young age. But he made his conclusions not about boys, not about male human beings, but about children and people. He said that human children develop their moral sense in this way. So in a way, he neglected the role of gender. And what Carol Gilligan did was she opened up that same kind of research project. She opened it up and added a new dimension to it, added the dimension of gender. And in that way, she extended the project of moral development that had started with Kohlberg. And when we do things like that, the benefit goes not just to women, the female human beings, but also to men. We become aware of what it means not just to be a woman, but also that certain findings they were already gendered. They were already about the psychology of men, psychology of boys. Okay, let's read. Gilligan claimed that whereas men tend to emphasize rights and individual justice issues, women emphasize responsibility and relationships. At least they tend to be like this. Does it mean that all women are like this, that these statements are true about all women? No, it doesn't. And it doesn't have to. It just means that when we expand the scope of our findings to include both men and women, we open ourselves to more variation in the data, including some of the attributes that are more prominent in the women in our sample. Let's continue. Women, according to Gilligan, have a more caring approach to moral reasoning, one that benefits the larger society and is less self-centered. All right. So again, once we understand this, the benefit of feminist psychology, the benefit of this way of expanding the way we know about psychology isn't limited to women, because gender becomes now an explicit category. So we can pay attention to both men and women. Okay, critique of feminism. One possible critique of feminism, which is covered in our book, is a Marxist critique. And according to that kind of critique, feminist psychology pays attention to a kind of inequality that is of secondary importance. It is not the most fundamental. It is not the most important form of inequality in society. According to Marxist critique, the most important inequality is based on socioeconomic class. Of course, in response to this critique, we might say, you don't have to choose to pay attention only to the feminist critique of society and culture. You can be informed, your work can be informed both by Marxist critique and by feminist psychology. Okay, so it's not an either or. You don't have to choose only one of them, and then when you choose one, you have to reject the other one. The two can combine. The other critique might say that feminist psychology, or the feminist movement more broadly, might create an opposite bias in favor of women. Okay, how should we think about this, this critique? I mean, of course, every form of knowledge, every form of activity, every form of practice can be mishandled, can be used instrumentally to harass other people, to intimidate other people. You can imagine like a person who apparently is persuaded and embodies feminist principles, intimidating other people, intimidating other men, or intimidating other women for not living up to the principles that this person is upholding. That I don't take to be a representative of the feminist psychology. That is when a field or a movement is hijacked by somebody for the service of their ego, for the service of them gaining power. So we shouldn't mistake that with feminist psychology itself. We shouldn't mistake the misuse of feminism, the misuse of feminist psychology, the use of feminist psychology for people to gain power over other people, to harass other people, to intimidate other people. We shouldn't mistake that with the thing itself. The thing itself doesn't aim to do any of those things. So the risk of creating a bias in favor of women is largely from the misuse of feminist psychology, because when we pay careful attention to feminist psychology, it is really about serving women, and through that, serving people in general. By explicitly paying attention to the political dimension of psychology, the dimension of gender in psychological knowing, it benefits people. So in fact, I believe that this new, relatively more recent trend in psychology that pays attention to men, this is a byproduct of feminist psychology. So in these books, I just picked 3 of them: A New Psychology of Men, Psychology of Men and Masculinity, The Neuropsychology of Men. Okay, this can happen, this kind of inquiries, research projects can happen after we have already made gender an explicit topic. We have already expanded our research projects to include the category of gender, and that is an achievement of feminism and feminist psychology. So the benefit is not limited to women. That was a point that I really wanted to emphasize. All right, what do you think? If you have any thoughts on feminism and its relation to psychology, let me know. Feel free to comment. And if ask questions to the best of my ability, I'll try to respond to questions. And next time, we will turn to cultural psychology. All right, that's all for now. Thank you for your attention, and until next time.